Good evening once again. It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to start rolling. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for the first installment of our virtual speaker series. My name is Kristen Norton. I am the Executive Director at the Laurel Historical Society, and I am joined tonight by Conor Conneally of the B&O Ellicott City Station Museum. Before I get into his formal introduction, I do just want to go over some housekeeping very quickly. So tonight's presentation is in the webinar format. We invite you to propose any questions you may have using the Q&A feature typically found at the wee bottom or on the sides of your screen, depending on your device. We will get to the questions at the end of the presentation, and I will be monitoring the chat should you all submit any comments or questions via the chat feature. As a reminder, we are recording tonight's program, so please be on the lookout for a link to view that recording early next week, and then we will share that video to our YouTube channel shortly thereafter. Before I get to the formal introductions, I do have to do 1.5 shameless plugs, and that would be if you are an architecture buff, a history buff, a railroad enthusiast, I invite you to please come to the Laurel Museum and please come to the B&O Ellicott City Station Museum. Laurel and Ellicott City are fortunate to still have their very significant historic train stations, and so we invite you to please come and enjoy them. We do have a current exhibit at the Laurel Museum called Laurel Rides the Rails, Tales of Trains and Trolleys, and that is running through December 21st of this year. Our exhibit is free. We're open 12 to 4, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I will be there all weekend, so please come by and see me. And of course, please come and see the Ellicott City Station Museum, which is housed in their historic train station. Now, to our formal introductions, I'm joined tonight by Conor Conneally, who is the manager of the Baltimore and Ohio Ellicott City Station Museum in Ellicott City. He told me that this station is the oldest station in the United States, which means you definitely have to go and see it. He's been with the Ellicott City Station Museum since 2021, although he's originally from Ireland, and he graduated from Queen's University in Belfast. He's worked for several years in the historic site and museum field, and we are delighted to have him here tonight. So Conor, thank you so much for joining us. I hand the virtual microphone over to you.
All right, thank you, Kristen, for that great interview. I'm going to share my screen now. And all right, so welcome everyone. Welcome virtually to my presentation, which is a history of the B&O Railroad's Washington branch. And my name is Conor Conneally, and I am the manager of the Ellicott City Station Museum, part of Howard County Rec and Parks. So first of all, to get the shameless plugs out of the way, the B&O Ellicott City Station, I recommend you to come. We are located in Old Ellicott City at the bottom of Main Street, just on Maryland Avenue. We're open 5 days a week, year round. Wednesdays and Thursdays, we're open from 10 o'clock until 3. Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, we're open from 10 until 5. And admission is free, so please feel free to come by, but we always appreciate donations. So to have that out of the way, just to talk about my museum, the Ellicott City Station is the oldest railroad station in the United States of America. It was the terminus of the first 13 miles of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was the first railroad to be built in the US. And the building itself dates from 1831. So it's a very significant historic site. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And fun fact, today, the 28th of August is 3 significant anniversaries. It was 28th of August, 1830 was the day that Tom Thumb was first debuted when it made its first journey between Baltimore and Ellicott City back in 1830. It's also the day they inaugurated the Oliver Viaduct, which is the railway bridge that spans Main Street. It has the Ellicott City sign if you know where it is. And also, on this day, 49 years ago, the Ellicott City Station was first formally opened as a museum on the 28th of August, 1976. So, we're coming up to our 50-year anniversary next year, but today is our 49th anniversary. But this presentation is going to be about the 190th anniversary of the B&O Railroad's Washington branch line, which first opened in 1835. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But before we talk about the Washington branch line, let's give a little bit of context of the history of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Now, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, it's a fairly significant historical thing. What people ask, why is it named the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad? Simple reason, it was built going from Baltimore to its intended destination, the Ohio River. Not the state of Ohio, but the river Ohio itself. So a little bit of context of why build a railroad in 18, and why would you want to build a railroad from Baltimore? So let's rewind the clock to the 1820s. Baltimore was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States of America. It was the third largest city in the US after New York and Philadelphia, and it was growing even faster. It had a big period of growth in the early 19th century and the lead up to the Battle of Baltimore in 1814. And in the 1820s was kind of a boom time. Its main advantage is its location. Baltimore is on the Chesapeake Bay, which means it's more inland than other ports in the nation, which was pretty important because you have to remember in the 1820s, the United States is a relatively new country, and it's a big country, and it's getting even bigger. More people are moving out west. They're going out to the new states and the new territories that are being formed out in the west. After the Louisiana Purchase, there was a lot of territory in the US, and a lot of people wanted to get out there. Big problem was, the fastest you could go was the speed of a horse or the speed of a sailing ship. It took a really long time for news, for people, for goods, for information to get anywhere, and this was a problem. The big challenge was, how do you keep the United States united? Now, Baltimore, because it was kind of more inland because of the advantage of the Chesapeake Bay, had that natural advantage. But by the 1820s, Baltimore was facing some new challenges. One of the big challenges was the era of canals. In 1825, the Erie Canal opens in the state of New York, which gives New York City a direct connection to the Great Lakes. Also in 1825, 40 miles to the south of Baltimore is the federal city of Washington, D.C. It was founded back in 1790. It was still, by the 1820s, a very small town. And they had started planning the building of a canal that would go along the Potomac River, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which would be going along the route of the Potomac towards the Midwest. Now, Baltimore had a challenge. It didn't. If you know anything about the geography of like the mid-Atlantic Maryland area, we are in the Piedmont area. We're in the foothills of the Appalachians. It would be incredibly difficult to build a canal going west from Baltimore, mainly because there's lots of low rolling hills. So Baltimore, a canal was not an option for him. But so in 1827, the civic and merchant leaders of Baltimore got together to discuss a brand new technology. The technology of railroads. Now, railroads or railways, both are correct depending on your usage. These were a relatively new thing in 1825. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary of it this month. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opens in the north of England, which was George and Robert Stephenson's first steam-powered railway, where steam-powered locomotives ran on steel rails carrying goods and people from Stockton to Darlington. This was a sensation at the time. And people in America were aware of what was happening in Britain. They saw this new technology, they saw it was very exciting, and they thought, this could be potentially a game changer for us. So in 1827, some of the civic leaders, some of the wealthiest men in America met together in Baltimore. The idea of building a railroad, the railroad that would go from Baltimore to the Ohio River. Now, why the Ohio River? Why build a railroad west? Why not build a railroad, say Washington, it's only 40 miles away, or Philadelphia, or New York? The main reason why they wanted to build a railroad going west was that they wanted the railroads to be a trans-Appalachian route, so Baltimore could get its goods out to the Midwest faster. They wanted to see if they could they wanted Baltimore to rival not Washington, but New Orleans, and being the major port in the nation where you could get stuff into the interior of the country. And they saw the railroad as being the solution to this problem. So the railroad is founded. It gets its charter in February of 1827. The next year, that summer, On the 4th of July, 1828, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence at the time, he was about 90 years old. He laid in a ceremony the first stone of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And he said that it was the most significant event in his life after the founding of the country, where he signed the Declaration of Independence. So that's a little bit of context. Why are they building a railroad between Baltimore and the Ohio River? I've got my laser pointer here. So this is the route of the survey route of the main stem, the main line of the B&O Railroad. Now, the challenge of the B&O of the railroad was this was the first railroad built in America. No one had ever built a railroad before. They were inventing this technology as they went along. The big challenge facing the surveyors who were planning the route of the railroad was, what route does the railway, what way does the railway go? We don't know what vehicles are going to be running on the railway. Steam locomotives did not exist on the United States yet. But they knew that if it was going to be any vehicle, it was going to be horse-drawn rail cars. But horses can't really pull heavy loads up a hill on rails. The rails are going to have to be flat and level of a direction as possible. So they decided that the railway is going to go west from Baltimore. It's going to go southwest, going basically parallel with the Washington Turnpike, which is now Route 1, going down through Baltimore County towards the Patapsco River. And then at the Patapsco River, at Relay, which got its name because it was the halfway point between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills, the railroad would follow the route of the Patapsco, going along west, following the kinks and curves of the Patapsco. Now, this is not the most direct route west, but with the technology they had in the 1820s, it was the most viable route. Ellicott City, or Ellicott Mills as it was known then, was the perfect location for the first terminus because it was a mill town located on the Patapsco. It was also on the Frederick Turnpike, which was the national road, which was the main route going west. So it was the perfect place to build a railroad too. So this is what the railroad, the first 13 miles, this is a map from the 1820s. You can see here the railroad, the first stone, this is where Charles Carroll laid the first stone of the railroad. The railroad goes southwest along the route of the Washington Turnpike to Elkridge Landing, kind of on the Baltimore County side was Relay. It was called Relay because it was the relay point. Horses can only go about 6 or 7 miles at a time before having to be changed out. Relay was the halfway point to Ellicott's Mills, so they had to relay the horses. And then the railroad would continue along the Patapsco River to here to Ellicott's Mills. So when the railroad first opened for public traffic in May of 1830, this was the route of the railway. Now, the railway would continue building along the Patapsco River. It would follow the route of the Patapsco, going to towns like Sykesville. Then it would go to Mount Airy, continue on to Frederick, and then eventually it would reach the Potomac at Point of Rocks, Maryland, where they would meet meet the Potomac River. So the important thing about the railroad was this was the first railroad. They were inventing the technology as they went along. Because they were the first, they had a lot of teething errors. They had a lot of difficulties developing the technology. Now, they were basing their technology off what was happening in Britain. Stephenson was kind of like showing how to build a railway. And in Britain, they were using iron rails. They were kind of T-shaped rails, which would become the standard. Now, in America, they didn't have enough iron to build iron railways. So what they did is they compromised and they built railways using a type of rail known as strap rail. Now, strap rail they had different forms of it. The most common one was you would have these big stone granite blocks, because what you have a lot of in the Patapsco River Valley is granite. This is where you would lay granite blocks, you would hammer in wooden rails, and on those wooden rails, vehicles would run on straps. There would be iron straps, which the train wheels would run on. This worked pretty good for horse-drawn rail cars, but the problem was this is incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult, and it took a lot of time learning them. The first 2 years of the railroad, they were basically learning how not to build a railroad. They were realizing that they had over-engineered, they had overdeveloped, and by 1832, when they had reached Frederick and Point of Rocks, they had enough experience to know what not to do. So, the railroad starts in 1830. It reaches Ellicott's Mills. By 1832, you can see my laser pointer here. It had gone all the way to Frederick. At Frederick, it had reached Frederick in December of 1831, and by 1832 they had reached Point of Rocks, Maryland. And at Point of Rocks, they had a challenge here because it was the only way to get past Catoctin Mountain, but they had to share the right of way with the C&O Canal, and there was a big legal fight over who would have the right of way of the canal. So the B&O builds out to Point of Rocks by 1832. Now, at the same time, there were discussions of building a new rail line, a rail line to Washington. Now, after the B&O was founded in 1827, lots of other railways were being founded at the same time. This kind of kickstarted a craze, especially after 1830, and a lot of railway charters were issued by the states. You had new railways being set up, like the Camden and Amboy, the Delaware and Hudson, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore railways. These were all being built. And one charter, which was proposed in 1830, was to be built a railway between Washington and Baltimore. Now, the B&O, their priority was building a railway going west towards the Ohio. They saw the potential of extending their rail line from Washington, from Relay, to go down to Washington. So they basically decided they would take on the charter of building this branch line so no one else could get it. So they would maintain their monopoly of kind of rail travel in Maryland. This was it was a bit of a tax dodge as well. There's a lot of funny accounting where the Washington branch line was like a subsidiary within the company, was technically a separate company within the B&O for tax reasons. It's confusing, and you don't need to know about that, but it was, funny bucks they had back then. So Washington branch line, this map is from 1858. This would be an extension of the rail line going from Relay, which was the halfway point between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills, and it would go south, following basically parallel the route of the Washington Turnpike towards Washington, D.C., which was the national capital. It was an important destination to build to. So the building of the Washington Railway really starts around 1832, 1833. Now, the route of planning the railway was actually previously done when they were considering building canals. When the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Canal was being planned, there was also a consideration of building a canal between Baltimore and Washington, which would then connect to the C&O Canal. That never came about. The Baltimore decided they were going to do railways instead of canals. But in 1828, there was a survey to survey a potential route going through central Maryland of the route of a canal that would go between Baltimore and Washington. So the B&O, when they decided to plan a route for their new railway between Baltimore and Washington, they basically copied the homework of the surveyors in 1828 and basically took the survey route for this canal and applied it to building their railway. Now, it was a lot easier building a railway south through Maryland, following the route of the Washington Turnpike, than it was going west because it's kind of flatter ground. So this route was drawn by Benjamin Latrobe Jr., who I'll talk about a little later. This is the route of the railway. So if you can see here, this is Baltimore. This is the start of the railroad. This is where the first stone would be. The railroad goes southwest along here for a few cuts. This is Relay, which was where the halfway point of the rail line. And from Relay, this is now this is the main stem. So the main stem at Relay continues going along west along the Patapsco like this. They decided that the Washington branch, they would build a bridge over the Patapsco River here. The rail line would continue going what is Howard County, going basically parallel with the Washington Turnpike, which is now Route 1, and then going down towards Little Patuxent, basically to where Laurel is now. So this is the route it would go through what is now modern-day Howard County. Then it would go basically through what is now PG County, Prince George's County, continuing along basically the Washington Turnpike, and then entering Washington, D.C. Now, the planning, if you want to get a better idea, this is a modern map of the Camden line. The Camden line is basically the exact same route of the Washington branch line, which is now today. The Camden line is now the modern day Washington branch line. As you can see, going from Baltimore, going all the way down here at Relay. This is the Relay point. So at this point, they had already built here. This is where the old main line continues along the Ellicott, along the Patapsco. They would continue the rail line going south towards Laurel, and then continuing going through PG County to what is now Bladensburg, Hyattsville, toward Washington, D.C. So a few bit of context of the route of the railway going south along the rail line here. So give you an idea, this is a fun little map. This was actually done by our graphic design team to a vision. The B&O Railroad was like a subway map or like a tube map in the 1830s. This is a route of how it went. So this is your old main line. This is the towns it would go through to Harper's Ferry going west. And this is the Washington branch line, which is, the second line. Give you an idea of the places the rail line goes to. Otherwise, a lot of these places didn't exist in 1836, but, bit of fun. So if you like this design, we have it available as a t-shirt, as a postcard. So shameless plug, if you were coming to the Ellicott City Station, you can get this really cool map that we have designed. This wouldn't have existed historically, of course. So they have decided the route of the Washington branch line, a line that would go from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. So first thing first is, who is building the line? And the overseeing the construction of the Washington branch line fell to this man here, Benjamin Henry Latrobe Jr. You might know the name Benjamin Latrobe, the architect of the Capitol, the guy who redesigned the Capitol building and also designed the Baltimore Basilica. That is Benjamin Latrobe Sr. Benjamin Latrobe Jr. is his son. He was also an engineer and architect, but so, there's a difference between the junior and the senior. Benjamin Latrobe and his brother John Latrobe were very prominent guys in the history of the B&O. They were active in it throughout their lives. Benjamin Latrobe first was hired under Jonathan Knight. He was the chief engineer of the railroad, and then he would then succeed Knight to become the chief engineer of the railroad. Now, Benjamin Latrobe, safe to say he was an engineering genius. He was a real kind of Renaissance man. He was very talented, very smart. And Latrobe, when building the railroad, the advantage he had from building a railroad in 1833 of planning and building a railroad going from Washington to Baltimore to Washington, as they had learned the mistakes of previous years. They learned how not to build a railroad. They had the experience. They had 5 long years of experience of building the railroad, going from Baltimore out to Harper's Ferry and Point of Rocks. And they knew how a railroad was built. They knew the mistakes, they knew how to manage things. They had established a ways of doing it. Instead of building strap rail, which they learned was very expensive and very difficult, and it was not a very efficient way of doing things, would have to be replaced, they decided they were going to use modern T-rail, modern iron rails, which is basically the rails you see today, with like the rails that shape like an inverted T. This diagram you see here actually shows a type of strap rail. They never actually use this. They use T-rail from the start. They imported rail from Britain, from great expense, actually, because America didn't have the scale of iron foundries that they had in Britain at the time, because America was less industrially developed at this time. But they knew they were building the Washington branch to modern standards, the most up-to-date technology which had been developed in the past 5 years. Also, unlike the old main line, they were going to use steam power. When the line first opened in 1830, they used horses. Horse-drawn rail cars made their way between Baltimore and Ellicott's mills. They intended that the Washington branch would be a steam railway that would use steam engines. So the first big challenge that faced Benjamin Latrobe from building a rail line from Relay to Washington, D.C. Relay was right on the Patapsco River, and it was also, if you know this area, it was kind of on a big gorge. They wanted to continue the rail line from where it was going. So the first challenge they had to do was to build a bridge across the Patapsco River, going from the Baltimore County side to now the Howard County side. And they decided that they would build a bridge that would be monumental in scale, the Thomas Viaduct. The Thomas Viaduct was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, and when it was built, it was the largest multi-arched railway in the world. And it was one of the first railway bridges to be built on a curve. It was a huge undertaking. It was massively expensive. And when they were building it, they called it Latrobe's Folly. They thought it would be too big and too heavy to stand up under its own weight. It's still standing today. Trains are still passing over it. But the building of the Thomas Viaduct began in 1833, and it would continue until April of 1835. It took 2 years of building of the rail line. The building of the rail line was overseen by Benjamin Latrobe. He was the architect and designer, and the construction of the rail line was done by a contractor from Ireland named John McCartney. Now, Benjamin Latrobe, he kept very detailed diaries, and his diaries from building of the Thomas Viaduct are filled with constant feuding between him and McCartney. McCartney was an experienced railroad contractor. He had built several sections of the old main line going to Ellicott's Mills. He had built the Patterson Viaduct, which spans the Patapsco River at Ilchester. Previously, he was experienced in building bridges. Now, the B&O Railroad built its bridges out of granite. They built them to be monuments, and mainly because the Patapsco River Valley has a lot of granite. It was built from locally quarried material, but the Thomas Viaduct was a huge undertaking and edifice. During its construction, several men died. One man named was Barney Doherty. He was an immigrant from Ireland. He fell from one of the arches of the Thomas Viaduct whilst it was under construction. He fell about 40 feet before striking his head and being killed instantly. Latrobe mentions in his diaries that all work on the railway stopped, and the laborers all basically had a large funeral for Doherty. And this was the kind of dangers and accidents that would happen during the building of the Thomas Viaduct. Thomas Viaduct is named for Philip Thomas, who was the president of the railroad, the first driver of the B&O Railroad, and that's why it's called the Thomas Viaduct. This picture is the Thomas Viaduct today, still standing. It is celebrating its 190th anniversary as well. It has freestone arches. This is taken if you're ever going to the Patapsco State Park, as you're driving in from the Route 1 entrance to the Avalon entrance, you drive under the viaduct. Sadly, the Thomas Viaduct is not as well kept by CSX as it should be. You can see all the trees and the sad state of the railings. It used to be able to walk right across the viaduct. You can't do it anymore. But the viaduct is still standing today. It is still an incredibly impressive monument to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And this is an icon of the B&O. Most of the B&O's publicity photography of its brand new engines, most of them showed them crossing the Albert Viaduct. But this was the start of the Washington branch line. And when it was completed in 1835, this was kind of the completion of the Washington branch. Now, building of the railroad, as I mentioned, were Irish immigrant laborers. Now, Irish laborers were basically a large portion of the workforce of the B&O Railroad. Why Irish immigrants? Basically, this was an established practice. About 60 to 70% of the railroad employees by 1830 would have been Irish immigrants. This was established in previous public works projects like the Erie Canal, on Turnpike building like the National Road. The Irish labor was cheap. It was renewable. There was always people coming over the Atlantic, and they were known to be hard workers. Recruiters in Ireland would recruit young men, kind of recruit them to come across the Atlantic, and then they would be hired on working on projects on canals and railroads. And they came over in huge numbers. This was basically, it was dangerous work. It wasn't very well paid work. You would be paid maybe about $13 a month, which, it's not a terrible wage, but not a huge amount of wage. And it was a clear path for employment. Baltimore was also a major destination for newly arrived immigrants coming from Ireland. It wasn't only just Irish laborers working on the railroad, you had also immigrants coming from Europe, from Germany. It would be a lot of German immigrants coming as well. You would have free labor as well. Free African American labor would have worked on the building of the railroad. Baltimore had a major African American population who were free. Enslaved labor likely was not used to build the railroad, mainly because it didn't make sense to. Immigrant labor was cheap and available. Slave labor was expensive. So that's why they used a lot of Irish labor. Now, when you have Irish people, sometimes you kind of have a violence. As I say this as an Irish person myself, as an Irish immigrant. There's a lot of negative stereotypes of the fighting Irish, and this all kind of has its roots in history. One major aspect of Irish immigrant labor on canals and railroads in the early 19th century was faction fighting. Now, faction fighting basically, you have to remember when immigrants were coming across the Atlantic, they weren't leaving home behind. They were taking their old traditions, their regional loyalties, their regional like dialects and language and that kind of and affiliations with them. A lot of guys before you have to remember Ireland was a very small place back then. Most people had never left their home county or their home province before traveling across the Atlantic. When men came across the Atlantic, they would kind of band together with their guys from their kind of region, their county, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, was a big difference as well. And this would help form factions. Now, this would there was a lot of faction fighting where guys from different regions, different allegiances in Ireland would kind of fight over each other, on work sites, basically for work and pay conditions. The faction fighting occurred in several occasions on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal building in 1834, but also during the building of the Washington branch line in June of 1834. There was a serious incidence of faction fighting between the Corkonians and the Fardowns. Now, the Corkonians are likely from County Cork in the province of Munster, so they'd be guys from the south of Ireland. The Fardowns would be guys, Fardowns, the origin of the name is kind of confusing. Likely would be from the Irish Midlands, so kind of County Meath, Westmeath, Roscommon, Longford. They were from very different parts of Ireland. And there would be tensions. There were over work and pay. This would lead to violence. In 1834, this broke into a riot, and there was major fighting near Elkridge Landing in modern-day Howard County, where there was major riots. Shanty homes of the workers along the rail line were burned. Men were attacked with pikes, bludgeons, firearm. At least 4 men were killed during this fighting. The fighting was so severe, the Maryland State Militia was dispatched to put down the fighting. And you can see from the quote here, it is believed that 4 or 5 persons have been murdered in these affrays, and broken heads, black eyes, and bloody noses are without count. Several being severely injured in their limbs. It is said they had collected about 40 muskets and appeared to resolve them against the troops. This riot actually, the faction fighting between the Corkonians and the Fardowns, a peace treaty was brokered by Caspar Weaver, who was the superintendent of construction of the railroad, and Reverend John McElroy, who was a Jesuit priest, who basically brokered a peace treaty between the two groups to make sure they wouldn't fight again. And this was happened a few instances in history, but it also happened here. Other major incidents of violence on the B&O Railroad during the building of the Washington branch occurred in November of 1834 during the building of the Washington branch line. Now, the building of the railroad itself did not build the railroad, if that makes sense. They would hire contractors. Contractors would bid for separate sections of the line, and the contractors were expected to hire their own laborers, build and hire them, have their own pay, making sure their working conditions are being met, and make sure that the railroad was being built to the specifications of the engineers. Some of these contractors, like John McCartney, were Irish. He was a contractor. Some of them were experienced road or canal contractors or engineers as well. There were a couple of major contractors on the Washington branch line. One of them was William Jessop, who he was overseeing building of a major cut, um, and Jessop's cut became, if you know Jessup, that's where it gets its name. Originally, it was known as Jessop's Cut because it was the cut of land where the railway was built, overseen by Jessop. Where the prison is, it was also known as Jessop's Cut or the Cut. So that's why it's called Jessop. Now, another contractor overseeing the building of the rail line was a man named William Watson. Watson was also an Irishman. He was overseeing the building of the rail line. In November of 1834, there was an altercation where a mob of angry workers on the rail line between Savage and Laurel were marched on William Watson's shanty hut. Basically, they attacked Watson. They clubbed him, beating him nearly to death, severely attacking him. He was nearly killed by this. His assistant, William Mercer, was also dragged out of his hut, and he was killed by his attackers. You can see here. There's a quote here. This is taken from the Niles Weekly Register. The outrages perpetrated by these cruel ruffians were sufficient to satisfy their bloodthirsty cravings. About Wednesday, or between that hour, on 1 o'clock yesterday morning, they surrounded the office of Mr. Watson, who was lying wounded, and breaking open the door, they deliberately murdered him in a most barbarous and shocking manner, the back of his head being cut open and the brains scattered about. Mr. William Mercer, one of Mr. Watson's assistants, was also present in the office when the attack was made and was dragged out and shot dead. Now, this was a severe act of violence. The motivations for this violence are unclear. It is likely that Watson was known as a very harsh worker, as a harsh manager, and apparently he had fired some men for previous times. This had led to bad blood. Potentially, Watson was a Protestant. He was an Orangeman. His workers were Catholics. There was probably likely a sectarian aspect to it as well. But this led to the murder of Watson and Mercer, and the near severe injuring of Peter Gorman. Because of this violence, this also led to severe rioting. The B&O state militia would also be dispatched to put down this riot. They were actually dispatched by rail, one of the first kind of movements of troops by railroad in American history, and they would arrest over 300 laborers who were rioting during after the murders of Watson. In January of 1835, Irishman Owen Murphy was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, and two other Irishmen, Patrick Gallagher and Terence Coyle, were also found guilty and sentenced to 18 years hard labor. So these are some incidences that occurred during the building of the rail line. They're unfortunate stories. They're kind of unknown stories. This is something that occurred. This would have happened fairly often in the building of rail lines. It's an unfortunate history. It's kind of an aspect of, like, as an Irish person, I'm talking about Irish history. It's not the best representation of Irishness, but it's still interesting, and it kind of shows you that, like, the rail line wasn't just a simple thing. There were serious acts of violence created during the building of the rail line. So we have the building of the rail line. The rail line was started in 1833, and they finished construction of the rail line by the summer of 1835. So 190 years ago, in August of 1835, the rail line opens for service. This was seen as a big celebration. And the big difference between the rail line, the Washington branch opening in 1835, as to opposed to the main stem opening in 1830, was this time they had steam power. They had a brand new fleet of steam-powered grasshopper locomotives designed by inventor Phineas Davis from York, Pennsylvania. His locomotives were known as grasshoppers. They had vertical boilers and they had big pistons that would go up and down like a grasshopper's legs, and that's how they got their name. Um, they were actually very reliable, and they actually remained in service on the railroad right up until the 1880s. This is the John Hancock, which is now in the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. This was built in 1836 for service on the Washington branch line. And this would have hauled the first train going from Baltimore to DC. This engine here is the Lafayette. It was built in 1837, and this would have been the next generation of locomotives to run on the rail line, which used horizontal boilers as opposed to vertical boilers, kind of using kind of best standards that were developed in Britain at the time. So the Lafayette had a horizontal boiler, and this was more efficient. This became the standard locomotive. When the rail line first opened in 1835, this was seen as a big event. They had a big kind of like parade in Baltimore, seeing the first train off. When the first train arrived in Beltsville, which would have been like the first stop outside of Washington, there was kind of like a welcoming committee. And when the train first arrived in Washington, D.C., it would have brought a train full of directors and kind of like senior members of the public into Washington, D.C. President Andrew Jackson did not attend the arrival of the train, but he did watch it from nearby. And then the directors of the B&O would call on Andrew Jackson and dine with Jackson. I'm not sure if the White House, but it says with President Jackson. So there was kind of a presidential aspect to going to Washington, D.C. Now, the other big innovation of the Washington branch line was they had brand new 8-wheeled coaches, brand new passenger cars that were designed to have increased the capacity of passengers going. So this is like the first kind of double trucked 8-wheeled passenger cars, which would become like the standard of passenger cars that you still see today. These are like basically modern coaches. They were built with wood, but they were said to be a lot more comfortable than previous rail cars, which were basically modified stagecoaches, where they took stagecoach technology and kind of adapted it for the railroad. This was purpose-built mass transit carriages, which, shows a real kind of innovation for its time. So, you're going between Baltimore and Washington. Now, Washington, you have to remember, back in the 1830s, was not a very large town. It was actually kind of a backwater. It was started in 1790, and then that's when it was founded. It was made the official capital around 1801, and Pierre L'Enfant was designing his street plan with the L'Enfant plan, where he had large boulevards and plazas. By 1830, however, most of that was largely unbuilt. Washington was a very small town. This is a painting taken from, I think, from where Alexandria is now. You can see it's kind of larger than life. You have the White House here, you have the Capitol building here, and you have the Naval Yard here. And you can see all around it, there's not very much. Washington was a very small town. People basically, it was for politicians. They would come in, they would do their voting, and then they would leave. And the problem of Washington is it took a long time to get anywhere. So if you're going to Washington by stagecoach, you didn't really want to stay around for very long. This is a great picture of where the Capitol building is now. The Capitol building back then looked very different because it didn't have the big dome. It's been changed a lot over the years. But you can see here, this is like where the mall is now. You can see all the trees, the big open streets. It wasn't a big town. It was a very sleepy southern town. This is a great picture. I love first trains coming into Washington, D.C. And you can see this is the Puffing Billy, the one-armed bandit trains that they had, the Lafayette-style trains, and the long train carriages here. And this is the train entering Washington, D.C., northeast of the Capitol. Washington was a one-horse town, and this is the horse right here. And there was also 2 cows. It's like right next to the Capitol. So like this was downtown DC back in the day. It was countryside. There was very little there. Washington before the Civil War was quite a small town. But the railroad really did open Washington up. It changed politics quite significantly because it meant it was possible for politicians to get to Washington D.C. To make votes, to do debates. It made it without having weeks of travel. Because say if you were coming from one of the outlying states, it would take you weeks of travel. I don't know if you can hear, but there's also a train passing by on the tracks now. The track, I'm on the outside on the platform. Um, Politicians were able to get into Washington, and this would help change American political culture because it meant the railroad had opened Washington up, and this was a big difference in just like political culture. In 1840, William Henry Harrison, he was the first president to arrive for his inauguration by train. Now, in his inauguration, he didn't wear a coat and he got sick and he died in 30 days. But he made his inauguration on time thanks to arriving by train on the B&O Railroad. Now, the railroad, as it entered DC, this is an overlay. This is taken from Herbert Harwood's book, The Impossible Challenge. This is how the railroad entered DC. This is where Union Station is now. But this is the railroad. Its terminus was right next to the Capitol. It was basically on 7th Avenue. So the Capitol is right here. This is the National Mall right here. And this is where the B&O station was. So the railroad literally took you to the steps of the Capitol. This is the B&O station. It was built in 1855 or 1851. This was designed by Nerncy and Nielsen, who are two architects who also designed Camden Station. And if you know the old Frederick station on Patrick Street in Frederick, this is the station here. And you can see the Capitol is right here, and this is where the station was. So the railroad really brought people into Washington D.C. It was right next to the station, right next to the Capitol building. It was on the mall. It's where the National Gallery of Art is now, is where the station is. So if that puts it in your mind. By the 1850s, there was fairly regular service between Baltimore and Washington. As you can see here, there were 4 trains a day leaving from Baltimore. Kind of in a commuter service. You had one early morning, mid-morning, afternoon train, and kind of late afternoon train. You can see the stops along here. So these are basically the same stops on the Camden line today. It would take you about 9:15. You would leave Camden Station. You would arrive in Washington City at 11:05. So not the best headways, but it would get you to Washington D.C. Back then, you'd be in less of a rush, but take you over an hour and a half to get between the two cities, travel to 40 miles, but you're also traveling by a steam train. So it kind of shows you the rate of travel between the two cities. It was, this really helped connect Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. Now, the Washington branch also saw a lot of technology developed. One of the most famous examples was in 1844, when Samuel Morse, the inventor of Morse code, he would send the first telegraph message in the United States from Washington, D.C., from the Capitol building to Baltimore, to the B&O's headquarters in Baltimore. When he sent the first telegraphic message, "What hath God wrought?" And this telegraphic message was sent by Morse, and the route of the telegraph lines were actually laid along the path of the B&O's Washington branch. This was an experiment. The B&O was very skeptical of this technology. They didn't really see the need for telegraphs. They didn't really, but they kind of agreed to let Morse lay his telegraph wires along the route of the rail line, as long as he did it underground, and they are actually laid in clay pipes underground, until they got to a point where they had actually put up telegraph poles. And this was when they sent the first telegraphic message. In 1844, this was an experiment. The B&O wouldn't adopt telegraph as part of its regular operations until about the late 1850s. Railroads, they didn't really adopt telegraphs right away, but the B&O were using them quite regularly by the 1850s. And this would be very important by the Civil War. Now, this presentation is not on the Civil War. I could do a full hour-long talk about the Washington branch in the Civil War. I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to, skirt over it briefly. Long story short, the Washington branch line was very important in the Civil War, mainly because it was the one rail line going in and out of Washington, D.C. which meant it pivotal for the Union war effort. The Washington branch line really helped connect Washington to the rest of the United States. And this was a big problem in 1861 during the succession crisis, when there was fears that Maryland, which was a slave state, would also leave the Union alongside Virginia. If that happened, Washington, D.C. would originally would immediately be surrounded by Confederate territory. The capital would have been lost before a shot being fired. Maryland did stay in the Union, but a big important part of that was maintaining railroads for the use of the Union government and the Union Army. It became pivotal that the Washington branch line would not be broken or sabotaged by Confederate saboteurs. So the Union Army was stationed throughout the Civil War as Union soldiers along the route of the Washington branch line as railroad brigades, basically to ensure that there was no sabotage occurring along the line. And this was most important at Relay on the Thomas Viaduct, which if the Confederates had damaged or blown up the Thomas Viaduct, this would cut off the Washington branch line immediately. So there was a major encampment of Union soldiers at Relay on the Howard County side, as well as the Baltimore County sides. There was two big forts there. This is taken from Fort Dix, and they were stationed there throughout the war. Long story short, the railroad was massively important for logistics and Union war operations. Hundreds of men would have traveled by rail during the Civil War. This is a scene of the Baltimore station in Washington during the war. You can see hundreds, if not thousands, of men kind of milling around at the station. This was like the main point. This is where, if you're a Union Army soldier garrisoning Washington, D.C., your first entrance would have been through the B&O. And the B&O Railroad and the Union government, Abraham Lincoln, worked very closely with each other to make sure that troops were being moved efficiently on the rails. A lot of history you can go to through this. I'm kind of skirting over everything just because I don't want to be here all night. But long story short, Civil War happens. The railroad was very, very important for the Civil War operations. The railroad helped the Union win the war and keep the Union united. By the end of the war, a lot of lessons were being learned. It was pretty obvious, and if I have my laser pointer here, that by the end of the war, it was pretty obvious to the B&O Railroad that the original 1830s line going west along the Patapsco to Point of Rocks here had really had its maximum capacity. As I said, the rail line was going along the Patapsco. It was twisty, it was turny, it was not a very efficient way of traveling, but it was the way they had the technology by the 1830s. It was also had very limited capacity because of the nature of it, because you couldn't go very fast. And it was also becoming obvious during the Civil War that Washington, D.C. became hugely more important during the Civil War. This federal government, as we know it today, was basically born during the Civil War. Washington, D.C. massively increases in size during the war as the scope of the federal government, of the War Department, massively expands, which means that Washington, D.C. is becoming a lot more important and a lot more people need to get into Washington, D.C. So the B&O, John Garrett, the president of the B&O, they decide that they were going to have to upgrade the rail lines in Maryland. So they decided that they would build a new branch, and they started construction in about 1868 of a metropolitan branch, which would go from Washington, D.C., going west along through Montgomery County towards Point of Rocks. And this meant that trains would be going from the west, would go along the metropolitan branch. They would all go through Washington, D.C., and then they would go up the Washington branch towards Baltimore and on to Philadelphia and New York. This meant that the original main line built in the 1830s, where Ellicott City is right here, this was largely bypassed. This meant that the old main line, as it was then known, was largely only used for heavy freight and for local passenger services. So heavy freight, just like the train that just passed my station there now, would mostly use this line. All fast passenger trains would go from Washington going west along the Metropolitan line. And the Metropolitan line is now the Brunswick line. So if you take MARC trains, if you're going from Washington out to Harper Ferry or any of these towns along here, if you ever take Amtrak services, you travel along the Metropolitan line. Sadly, the original main stem passenger services would continue on the main stem until 1949. They were discontinued then, and now the original B&O Old Main Line is only now CSX freight. There's no passenger services on this line. So by the 1870s, you had three main lines, which basically created a triangle. You had Baltimore at one end, Washington at one end, and Point of Rocks just west of Frederick on the other. So this is basically the main lines in central Maryland today built by the B&O Railroad. The Metropolitan branch became very important for railway operations, mainly helped drive commuter railroads as well, as long as the Washington branch. And you can see here goes from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., goes through central Maryland, through Laurel to Washington. In fact, Howard County, when they split off Howard County from Anne Arundel County, it all used to be part of Anne Arundel County. When they had to split off Howard County and create Howard County in 1851, they needed to find a border. They decided that the border would just be the B&O Railroad Washington branch line. So that's the border between Howard County and Anne Arundel County. So if you're driving along Route 100 and you cross the railroad bridge and you see the sign, "Welcome to Anne Arundel County," that's why. The railroad literally shaped the geography of the county map of Maryland. But as you can see here, the B&O rail line goes south through Laurel, through Beltsville to Washington. The B&O had a monopoly on railroads. By the 1860s, John Garrett, before the war, he was met by a business concern of building a new rail line that would go from Baltimore to the Potomac River to a town called Port Tobacco on the Potomac. John Garrett, the president of the railroad, saw this proposal, didn't think much of it. The charter was made. It kind of went nowhere because it was during the war. After the war, there was a charter for a railroad going from Baltimore to the Potomac River, the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad. This charter existed, but no one was actually doing anything with it until the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the B&O Railroad's great rival. There's the B&O and the Pennsylvania Railroad, were kind of the two major mid-Atlantic railroads, and they really were in competition with each other in terms of trans-Allegheny routes going west. The Pennsylvania Railroad, what they did was they purchased the charter for the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, which would be a railroad going from Baltimore down to the Potomac River. But they also had charter rights to build a branch line from their main stem going into Washington, D.C. So they were able to build a railroad going from Baltimore to Washington, even though officially it wasn't a Baltimore and Washington railroad. Because of this, when the B&P Railroad was built and opened in the early 1870s, it meant that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had lost its monopoly of rail travel going into Washington, D.C. And the B&P Railroad would then link up to the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, the PW&B, which was the main railroad going between Baltimore and Philadelphia. That was also controlled by the Pennsylvania Railroad. So you had a rail line going from Philadelphia to Baltimore to Washington. This all became part of the Pennsylvania Railroad system, and then eventually this would become the Northeast Corridor. The Pennsylvania Railroad eventually would become Penn Central, which eventually would be taken over by Amtrak. So the Penn Line, which if you ever take the train or the Acela or Amtrak services, this is the B&P. This is the route of the B&P Railroad. This is the Penn Line, which went from Pennsylvania Station in Baltimore to the B&P Station in Washington. The B&P Railroad Station, you can see it's a very grand station building as well. This is also on the mall. This building is significant because it is the site of President James Garfield in 1881. In the waiting room of this railroad station, he was assassinated by Charles Guiteau. The station that he was waiting in the railroad station when Cateau went up and shot him in the back. So the B&P station became very important historically for this reason. The president was shot in a railroad station, but he wasn't shot in a B&O railroad station. Now, both the B&P station and the B&O station, they were both torn down in the early 1900s to make way for Union Station, which was the B&O and Pennsylvania station, which opened in 1907. And that's why you have Union Station, a glorious, beautiful building that they did an amazing job restoring recently. That was because it was a union between the B&O and the Pennsylvania, which took a lot of work to do. So that's why there's two rail lines going into Washington. Most travel is done on the B&P or the Pennsylvania Railroad today. Now, although it lost its monopoly of passenger service going in and out of Washington, the B&O really prided itself on style and class, and its passenger services on the Washington branch would become household names. They had lots of name trains like the Royal Blue, the Capital Limited, which were their express trains going from New York to Baltimore to Washington and points west. This was, the B&O was not the fastest railroad, but it was a railroad that had most class. It really kind of prided itself on having luxury, smooth rides, luxury cars, and this was kind of the premium kind of way of traveling. You can see here, this is the Capital Limited. The Capital Limited was kind of like the premier line going from Washington to New York, going along the route of the B&O Railroad. You can see here is crossing the Thomas Viaduct. This picture is actually taken in 1971 during the last run of the Capital Limited, because in 1971 Amtrak is formed and all B&O passenger services are then taken over by Amtrak, who still, they don't anymore, but continued on the Capital Limited name. But this was like an important part of passenger service, and the B&O and Washington really kind of branded itself together. The B&O really branded itself as the Capital Line. By the 1870s, the B&O was using the Capitol Dome as its logo because it was seen as the entrance into Washington, D.C. You can see these are beautiful guides. These were created by the B&O, guides to Washington. These are all available on the Internet Archive. I recommend looking them up. They have beautiful illustrations. They would create these beautifully illustrated, designed kind of guides to Washington, D.C., the things you could see there. And you can see this map here of how the B&O Railroad takes you into the District of Columbia. As Washington, D.C. expanded and grew, the B&O really focused its kind of corporate identity as being the capital idea, as the capital line. Even though Baltimore was in its name and its headquarters were in Baltimore, it really saw itself as being like the premier rail travel for getting into Washington, D.C. This is where your politicians, senators, congressmen would all travel on the B&O going out of the city. Now, as we talk about stations on the Washington branch, I talked mostly about Baltimore and Washington. The B&O, when the rail line first opened for public traffic in 1835, they didn't really build passenger stations. The concept of passenger stations in the 1830s didn't really exist. They didn't really see the need for them. Ellicott's Mills, the depot here I'm sitting in, was originally designed as a freight depot. It didn't become a passenger station until the 1850s. The B&O did not build many permanent passenger stations in its first couple of decades. May have built some shelters for people to wait, but there weren't really kind of grand edifices. By the 1850s, this is when the B&O was really investing in passenger facilities. That's when they started building large stations in Baltimore, like Camden Station, or the station in Washington, D.C. But by the 1870s and 1880s, after the opening of the Metropolitan branch, which was going west from Washington, D.C., they would hire on an architect, Ephraim Francis Baldwin, Francis Baldwin, to build and design stations along the railroad. And if you know anything about like stations along the railroad tracks, you can see stations like in Sykesville, Point of Rocks, Or in Laurel, Laurel's Station was designed by Francis Baldwin, kind of really ornate Queen Anne style. Most of the stations along the Washington branch were small kind of wooden stations. There was two outliers. There was Laurel Station, which is the last surviving Baldwin station on the Washington branch. And there was also a station in Hyattsville, which you can see here. Sadly, that was torn down in the 1950s. Laurel is the only survivor of the Baldwin era. Most of the other stations along the Washington branch were quite small. They were kind of like, they weren't sheds, but they were nice sheds. So this is the Beltsville Station. This is the Hanover Station, just next to Elkridge. Very kind of ornate stations. They weren't grand edifices. They were mostly small timber kind of shelters. Sadly, most of them were torn down long ago as passenger service was winding down. Now, as we say about passenger service, by the 1950s, passenger travel was in serious decline. The B&O Railroad was severely reducing its passenger services. Commuter lines, the Washington branch did remain a very important commuter line. Kind of commuting was kind of invented in Washington, D.C., of people traveling from outlying like kind of suburbs and towns going along the tracks towards Washington, D.C. to work in the federal government. By the 1950s and 1960s, commuting was mostly done by these RDCs, the rail diesel cars, which would make their way along the Washington branch line. The B&O continue operating commuter services. In 1971, that's when Amtrak takes over all passenger services. The B&O would continue operating some commuter services right up until the mid-1970s. By the 1980s, the Maryland Department of Transport had taken over the operation of commuter services, and that's when MARC, the Maryland Area Rail Commuter, which is a stupid name, but that MARC is the local commuter line, and they would take over services on the Washington branch line or the Camden line because it departed from Camden Station. This is the MARC station, Camden Station. I took this picture last year when the last time I was there. Now, the Maryland Department of Transport took over operation of trains and operation of commuter trains. They did not take over operation of the tracks. The tracks were still continually owned by CSX. CSX is the successor railroad to the B&O. So the B&O Railroad in the 1970s merges with the C&O Railroad to form the Chessie system. In the 1980s, the Chessie system merges with the Seaboard system to form CSX. And CSX is one of the four major railroads in the United States today. The lines are still operated by CSX. The Washington branch line was continued to be run by CSX, but they would have an agreement with the Maryland Department of Transport to operate passenger services along the tracks. So you can see here, this is MARC services today. So these are the maps of the three main MARC lines. So you have the Camden line, which is the B&O's Washington branch line, which goes from Baltimore to Union Station. You have the Brunswick line, which is the B&O Metropolitan line, which goes from Union Station along here to Point of Rocks and then out to Martinsburg in West Virginia. And then you also have the Penn line, which was the B&P Railroad operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad, they would become eventually Penn Central. And then in the 1970s, when Penn Central fell apart, it would be nationalized and become part of Conrail. The Northeast Corridor, which was the Pennsylvania main line, was kind of born out of that. And when Amtrak was created, they created the Northeast Corridor, which was a dedicated passenger right-of-way, but goes all the way from Boston down to Washington, D.C., along the old Pennsylvania Railroad line. The Penn line would become dedicated passenger right-of-way with electrified lines. The Camden line, however, still remains operated by a freight railroad, still remains operated by CSX. So the Penn line, that's why they have a lot more passenger services today running on the tracks. That's why you have regular Amtrak services, the Northeast Regionals, MARC services. The Camden line, however, because its trains are run both agreement with CSX, CSX own the tracks. They can run the trains whenever they want. It's their tracks. They have control over it. That's a big reason why the Camden line, although it's still a commuter line, has very limited service. Only has kind of weekend or only has morning and afternoon service, kind of like the 9 to 5 service. Only on weekdays. They have no weekend service. This is largely because CSX still own the line. CSX they control what's on the tracks, and that's because of that. There's very little the Maryland Department of Transport can do to increase it without agreement of CSX. This is unlikely to change anytime soon, unless there's political will. We have politicians who are willing to make an agreement with CSX or purchase the Camden line outright from CSX and build it as a use it as a dedicated passenger right of way. The same is true for the Brunswick line, but the Brunswick line also has more capacity because it also has Amtrak trains, like the Capital Limited going west. So, as you can see here, this is a good map showing you the free tracks today. So what you don't see on this map is the old main line going along Howard County, because that's not a passenger track. So you only have the bottom of the triangle. You don't have the top of the triangle here. And you can see here very clearly, this is Howard County, this is Anne Arundel County. The border between the two is the rail line, because it was a good place to draw a border. It was a line that existed. So I have been talking for too long. I am going to open up for any questions.
Well, we have one comment from Karen. She says, very interesting. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Tracy does ask if there is a book that covers this history.
Yes. So the Great Bar, the Great Bar of the Good Seal. I don't know if you can see me. I have basically borrowed most of the information I talked to you today are taken from 2 books. Impossible Challenge by Herbert Harwood and The Great Road by James Dilts. Impossible Challenge, I don't know if you can see it here. Basically, this is where I got most of my information. Sadly, there's 2 prints, one in the 70s and one in the 90s. Sadly, they're both out of print, but you can get it on Amazon or like used books very easily. Very good, very readable book. It's probably the best book written about this. There's also The Great Road by James Dilts. Dilts is kind of like, he is the B&O historian. He's the one who did the big write-up. It's a big book here. It's still in print. You can still get it. You can get it fairly cheaply online as well as on the Internet Archive if you know how to do that. I definitely recommend them. They are basically my textbooks that I used for this today. Most of the pictures that you saw, I kind of took from those books as well. So, you know, I did not do all this research. I took these from these books.
Peter also asks, when did passenger service end, for example, including the Sunnyside station just south of Beltsville?
So in terms of actual passenger, I don't know like when stations closed. I don't know the exact dates. There are still passenger services on the Camden line. When the B&O, they would end up rationalizing a lot of their stations over the years as demand fell. I think when Mark or the Maryland Department of Transport took over as commuter operations from the B&O in the late 70s, they kind of reduced a lot of the stations along the line to kind of keep the core ones. They also did invest in building new stations. So like the one at Dorsey, for example, that was built by Mark. That's a brand new station. They upgraded a lot of facilities. A lot of the stops, like Savage, is basically just a halt. But they're kind of limited by how much they can put on the tracks. But, you know, there still is, like, you can still take the Camden trains on weekdays for commuter services. Not as often as there should be, though, but, you know, that's out of their hands.
All right. Well, I don't see any additional questions, although Connor, I thank you for putting your email up just in case there are any questions that pop in.
Yes, so my email is cconneally@howardcountymd.gov. Please feel free to shoot me an email. If you have any other questions, any other thoughts, comments, I'll happily send me an email and I'll happily look at them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Connor, for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed that presentation. I know those of us who joined tonight did as well, and the many who registered and watched the recording will get to enjoy it too. So I think our time has come to an end, seeing no other questions. And I just want to say this is the first of 3 speaker series that we are doing. And so I hope you will save the date for our September talk on September 25th on a completely different topic, how to build a vibrant garden with Jimmy Rogers. We'll give an update on the native gardens at the Laurel Museum as well during that. And so thank you so much, Connor. That was wonderful.
Just before I go, I do want to plug a couple of other presentations and events that we will be having at the B&O station. So we have a couple of events happening in September. On the 13th of September at 2 o'clock, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of our model railroad. Was first started in September of 1975. Our model railroad in our freight house. We'll be having a presentation talking about the history of our model railroad. That will be happening on the September 13th at 2 o'clock. Also, the next week, on September 20th, we changed the date. Will be a presentation I will be doing called Railroading Before the B&O, which will be a presentation about the early history of railroading before the B&O Railroad, talking about the Stockton and Darlington and other early railways before the B&O was founded. And on the 27th, we have a lot of events happening in September. We will have Civil War reenactors coming to Ellicott City on the 27th of September. So if you want to see some Civil War soldiers doing some reenactment events, that will be happening then. And in October, we will be having our Museum After Dark events. I will be doing after hours tours of the Ellicott City Station, talking about the history of accidents and injuries along the railroad, talking about the darker aspects of railway history. So we have 4 different events of that happening. We have one on Halloween night on October 31st. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to come along and register. I think the link is to all that registration is on the Howard County webpage. So if you Google Ellicott City Station Museum, Howard County Government, you should be able to find it.
Yes, and I will also drop that in the chat, and then we will include information on those events in our post-event email recap when we send you the recording. So
Okay, super.
tis
Okay.
the season for events like that, and
yeah, it's all everything's happening in September. Not after a quiet summer, it's all happening in the fall.
So thank you again, Connor. We really appreciate your time. What an informative presentation. You're getting lots of wonderful feedback in the chat as well. I want to make sure you see that. All right. Well, wishing you all a very happy Friday Eve, and we hope to see you in person soon.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again for joining. Bye.